Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask me if I could talk a little bit about hypertrophy, or hypertrophy, sorry, that's the correct pronunciation, versus hyperplasia in humans, and if you can train for each one. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. You know, this is stuff I've talked about in the past, kind of like when we start talking about things like myofibrillar versus sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, all these other big science words. Okay guys, for those who don't know the difference, hypertrophy is when your individual muscle fibers get bigger, right? They get bigger in diameter, they get thicker. That's what we call gains, right? Gains, thickening of muscle fibers, which generally produces a direct correlation in force production. You get stronger as a result of that. And that is a fact. That is a scientific fact. You get stronger when a muscle fiber gets thicker. So that kind of goes hand in hand. So we have hypertrophy, but then there is something called hyperplasia, which is the splitting of cells in the body into two different cells that still comprise the same total size. So it's creating new fibers, so fiber splitting. Well, these are both common methods that the body uses to grow tissues, right? Because either cells need to grow or cells need to divide. Well, when we're talking about hyperplasia of muscle tissue, this is something that we see in the animal world. Actually, we see it somewhat routinely in the animal world. But we don't really see it in humans like when we can see it happen firsthand. Like we've not been able to do studies to where we actually see it occur. Now, there is some studies that have been done on professional bodybuilders that have looked at it that suggest that they have hyperplasia, but we can't replicate it with training. And that's the interesting thing. That's the interesting thing. Now, what does that tell us about these pro bodybuilders? Because we've been able to do it in animals. Actually, we've been able to do resistance training animal studies and make it happen to animals, not humans. So why are bodybuilders seeing it? Well, what we're thinking here, there's two lines of thought that go with this. Some researchers who looked at this and found a bunch of these bodybuilders had way more muscle fiber cells in the muscles they checked than they should, but they weren't necessarily always as hypertrophy as they should have been for their size. So a lot of these guys had a lot of extra muscle cells. And they concluded maybe people who go into professional bodybuilding just have a genetic predisposition towards that. They just have more muscle cells than the average person. They're born with it as part of their genetics, and therefore that's the people who have the potential to become professional bodybuilders. Well, the problem with that is that we don't find that in the drug-free demographics. In other words, when that's been looked at in other people, or that's been looked at in novice lifters, when they do these studies, we don't find that. We don't see that. This is what we see like in professional, non-drug tested bodybuilders. So that's one theory they have. The other theory behind why they see that is that some of the specific drugs that they utilize are causing hyperplasia to occur. Now, there's a bunch of bro science based around that. Let's look at the animal studies and look at the drugs. And there have been bodybuilders who've done some bro science over the years who've decided that maybe certain types of training combined with certain drugs can cause this to occur at a higher rate. That's a different topic. When it comes to training, one of the most pivotal studies we had to where we saw such an extreme amount of hyperplasia in an animal that we saw it over double the amount of muscle that it had by doing so, because we saw so much cell division and then subsequent hypertrophy in those muscles that this animal over doubled the amount of muscle that it had within a couple of weeks through that entire region of its body. It was some of the most enormous growth we've ever observed, and that was done on pigeons, right? And what the researchers did, they hung a tremendous weight off of a pigeon's wing and left it there for several days straight, for like a week. And it caused something like 150% increase in muscle mass in that entire shoulder, wing, back, chest, everything of that pigeon from that pulling on it. The problem is that it was several times the pigeon's body weight being hung from its limb for days on end without being removed. Now, where a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, well, so couldn't we do that in humans? No, and this is now. I'm not saying it's from an ethical review perspective that it was right to do this to animals. There are going to be some people who are going to chime in and say that's terrible, that's horrible that they did that to those pigeons. You know, you might be right. I'm not going to disagree with that logic. However, when it comes to ethics review boards, there are things that you are allowed to do to animals that you cannot do to human beings in scientific studies. I think most of us are aware of this fact. That's a big point of debate, of ethical debate out there, but it is a fact at this time. This sort of study would never be allowed to be done in a human being. Like you're talking about like Auschwitz, Nazi Germany type experiments at this point. We're talking about treating people horrifically. Right? You're talking about treating people horrifically in this case. Because people say, well, what do you mean? Well, let's say right now you're a 150-pound man hanging a weight that is 5 times your body weight off of one of your arms and leaving it there for 72 hours straight while you're immobilized and it's held. How much weight is that? 5 times your body weight, that's what, like 750 pounds? That would be a 750-pound weight being strapped to your arm and hung and pulling on your shoulder and leaving it for 72 hours. The amount of pain that you would be in would be excruciating. Like you would have to be sedated for that. Like you would probably need to be knocked unconscious, be given painkillers, everything else, to even endure that. It would be basically, it would be torture, right? It would be a continual, several day long torture. That's what it would actually qualify as. It would be illegal to do this to a human being, even with their permission. This would never make it into a scientific review board. So the thing is, we can't test this in humans. It's not ethical to test this in humans. It's not humane to test this in humans. We're not going to see this studied. It is very unlikely that you're going to see this sort of research replicated in a human being because it would be torture, right? And I'm going to say that the overwhelming majority of us out here would look at that and say, yeah, that's not cool. That's not right. Let's not do that. So that's part of the problem we have with research like that has been done on the animals. People already question whether it's even right to do that to an animal. That's already been questioned. So when we're talking about doing it to a human being, not going to happen. So we don't really have a way to directly study that. So we know that extreme stretching can do this, right? This can create hyperplasia. So what has been speculated by a number of bros over the years, because they do notice that this research has been done. So we saw actually years ago, I believe it was part of dog crap training, DC, it's made by Dante, years ago had people do weighted stretches at the end of the training. And it was part of his training protocol because he believed, based upon some of this, that it could cause muscle growth through hyperplasia based upon these animal studies. It wasn't certain because obviously, I mean, we're not talking about the same sort of weights or the time frame. So he's talking about taking stuff like a 50-pound dumbbell and stretching your triceps for, 60 seconds or something at the end of after training your triceps, right? While utilizing substances, because the DC training actually, he had a whole thing called cycling for pennies, and it involved how to get the most result for every dollar you spend on anabolic drugs. And he did a whole article on that many, many years ago. Like, we're talking about well over a decade ago. And it was really popular and circulated on the internet. He talked about that to some extent of hoping to get that same effect. But you need to keep in mind, that is not even remotely close to what was done in the animal study. It's not even comparable. 60 seconds versus 3 days. 50 pounds versus 750 pounds. This is very, very, very different. Very different. But his idea was that it would pull on the muscle fascia, that if you had a pump still from your training, because you would have people do all this rest pause training, that while you still had that pump and that the tissue was swollen as a result of it, that it would be more susceptible to stretching because the muscle fascia were already kind of stretched as a result of being pumped. And so that weighted stretch could hopefully elicit this response. And if it couldn't do it on its own, it would hopefully happen in combination with the drugs. Because what we found in animal studies is that when animals are given things like IGF-1 or growth hormone and things in large quantities, which again, we noted animal studies and human studies that things like trenbolone cause an enormous increase in IGF-1 production. So what Dante had speculated, based upon that maybe guys who are on trend, because you always have guys who are on a little bit of trend with a bunch of tests and things like that, that maybe guys who were on trend, that would elicit that response. Or, who were using IGF-1 and things like that. So that was essentially what he did. Now, when we come back over to the drug thing, I think that it is fair to say, based upon the muscle biopsies that were done, it found that a bunch of pro bodybuilders, and this was done well over a decade ago, that they had an unusually large number of muscle fibers, would indicate that some of the substances they were using probably caused that to happen, right? Because, the problem we have, though, is that we could speculate and look at animals and say, okay, what's done this in animals? What might do this in people? And it's hard to tell because bodybuilders are walking lab experiments. Some of these guys use cocktails of drugs in stacks that are sometimes on 9 or 10 different things at the same time, sometimes using doses that are 20, 30, 50 times higher than they would ever be used in a clinical setting on the actual dose. And I do mean that literally. Like sometimes 100 milligrams is used in a clinical setting, they'll use 5,000. And I do mean that this is actually what happens in pro bodybuilding. So at a certain point, trying to even figure out what in the heck these guys have taken that have caused this to happen, we can only speculate. We could look at animal studies and create some speculations. Is it fair to say that maybe something like what Dante is suggesting, that maybe the weighted stretching combined with that? And then some other people speculated that when people are on some of these substances, that any sort of stretch reflex exercise could cause this, right? That anything that causes a stretch reflex in the muscle might elicit this response, combined with different substances. This has all been speculated and it's been looked at, but the reality is this falls into such a gray area of bro science and bodybuilding lore that finding the truth of that's not going to happen. What we have noted, though, is that in human clinical trials from various training methods, the training methods that we can subject people to, that people can do safely, that people can do, without more than, some discomfort. There's always some discomfort involved with hard training, but not excruciating pain. That normal training protocols that we can subject people to, we have not been able to cause hyperplasia to actually occur in muscle tissue in humans, under normal circumstances. So at the end of the day, it really at this point isn't something that we need to be worried about other than just to look at as a curiosity. As far as humans go, because most of you out there who, if you're drug free and you're just lifting weights and training, it's not something that you're going to see happen. We haven't been able to replicate it in a lab. So just worry about hypertrophy. Just get your muscles bigger, get them stronger. Everything's going to work out. Save the hyperplasia for the walking lab experiments because they don't even know what's causing it in them. That's been subject to different theories from everyone from the researchers who's looked at it, all the way to different bro scientists and bodybuilding chemists and everyone else. So they've actually put a lot of effort into trying to figure it out, and there's no definitive conclusions there. So, other than it being a curiosity that's interesting to look at, I would say for most people, it's not something you really need to worry about. Just get in and train for hypertrophy, everything's going to be fine. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.